I appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't know how good this is going to be.
Might be, you have to reverse it. You might be going the other way.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's what I'm doing. I'm sorry. Yeah, there you go. I told you I was not very good at this. So I'm going to call the meeting to order at this time. Let's see. This is for members of the public. This is a property notice meeting to be held in accordance with the requirements of Florida law. Members of the public will be given a reasonable opportunity to be heard on propositions before the board as those items are addressed on the agenda. For public comments on matters not being considered by the board today, a general public comment period will be provided, and that will be at the beginning of the meeting to address the board on matters within its jurisdiction. Each person addressing the board shall limit comments to 3 minutes. A person shall not address the board or any members thereof unless specifically recognized by the chairperson to do so. Once recognized, members of the public shall address their comments to the board as a whole. Public comment is intended for the board to hear from the public and shall not be considered an opportunity to demand immediate responses from the board or its members. Board members shall not engage in dialogue with persons making public comment unless the question or comment is directed through the chair or made with the permission of the chair. So with that, I would ask, is there any public comment for items that are not on the agenda?
Can I get you to do a roll call?
Okay, before we do that, we'll do roll call. If we could just go around the room. I'm Wayne Flowers. I am substituting today for Mike Adams, who is not able to be here, vice chair, so I'm chairing today in Mike's absence.
J.B. Miller.
Trey Asner, Cultural Resource Coordinator.
Sean Melvin, Environmental Specialist.
Keely West, County Attorney's Office.
Jim Watson. Ollie Smith. Travis Minch.
Elizabeth Guthrie.
Shorty Robbins.
Okay, and I see Jan Brewer over there from the county. And
Ryan King, Parks and Recreation.
okay, thank you. All right, now back to any public comment for items that are not on the agenda. Do we have anyone wishing to make comments at this point? Hearing and seeing none, I will move on to approval of the minutes. Has everyone had an opportunity to review the minutes?
Just one question, is he still on mute? I mean, if he wanted
No,
to chime
he-
in, you can chime in. Okay.
Yes.
Has everyone had an opportunity to review the minutes from our meeting in April?
Yes.
Do I hear a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Okay, and do I hear a second?
Second.
All those in favor
Do we have any
indicate by...
discussion on that?
Okay, I'm sorry.
How does that work? Is it usually motion,
So,
second, and then
yes, so
to
normally a
discuss?
motion and a second lays the item on the table, and then when it's on the table, it's open for discussion and deliberation until the chair calls for the vote.
Right, so Travis, if you have some comments on the minutes, please
I do.
let us know.
In fact, I have a lot, and sorry to kind of slow us down already. But this is a item that we've discussed for quite some time here. I think at every meeting we've talked about the meeting minutes.
Mhm.
I did have the opportunity to get the recordings from Ryan that were audio taped, which actually were very good. I don't know if anybody else had asked for the audio recordings. Audio recording quality was decent. You could pretty much understand what is being said. Can't always identify who said it, but I think it's a great tool to go back and kind of remember. And I used it today to just remember kind of what we discussed at the last meeting, so I was able to sort of better prepare myself for today. With that said, having the meeting minutes or the audio recordings to match up to the meeting minutes, I could kind of start to better recognize where we maybe missed some of the detail, important detail, I would say, in the meeting minutes, and where some things captured in the meeting minutes were in fact not accurate. So I guess my first item that I'd like to point out is on bullet point number 4, and it begins that Mr. Minch spoke about, I'm sorry, that's fine. You know, Ryan did say that there was not capacity on the webpage. Side note, I did check on that with the firm that hosts the meeting minutes and such at the county. The firm is called Swaggit. They said audio files are nothing to add to the package because we're talking about megabytes. We're not talking about gigabytes, we're talking about megabytes here. Our audio files wrap up in megabytes. If you just had a 50 gigabyte pen drive, you added it into a computer, so megabytes here. They can add to our package to post our audio recordings on the same GTV website without anything. We've only got 5 meetings a year. So, you know, there's a saying, if it's a priority, you'll find a way. If it's not a priority, you'll find an excuse. I think this committee is important enough that we have the audio files available for everybody to digest. We meet on Tuesdays at 1:30. The working public can't attend, right? I mean, we've got one person in the audience here who's, I guess, you work at the county, right? Where's the public? Not here, because they're working. So my point here is that we don't have detailed minutes. The audio recordings are important. Let's make them available. The technology exists today to get megabytes on a website. So let's not find an excuse for why we can't do it.
Can we stop for just a second and let me just inquire of staff? I mean, is that something that you can follow up on?
I mean, for discussing it with Ryan, I mean, as Mr. Minch said, what he told me is that at this time, MIS notified Ryan that the files are just the files that come from our recording device are too large to be uploaded along with all the other information that we're already uploading onto the web page for public access.
So is it a question of perhaps asking the county administrator or someone in the county commission about providing whatever resources are necessary if they deem it sufficiently important to be able to expand the capacity? Or I'm not a tech person, so
It can be done.
I mean, it's something we could at least look into and revisit because, I mean, I do agree there is maybe a solution, but I mean, that's not something that can be guaranteed at this time.
Can I ask for you to report back to us? And Travis, perhaps you can talk with Ryan, if you haven't already, between now and the next meeting.
I mean, this isn't a tough thing to do, right? I mean, I trust our staff has the capability to get this done.
Okay.
So let me get to the point then, if I can.
Sure.
Item number 1 was, if you go to that in the meeting minutes, it says the board members spoke on the property evaluation scoring criteria and the average rated scoring. After much dialogue, the board approved the selection criteria with Travis Minch opposed, stating that additional clarification is needed with some of the categories. I did oppose. I was the only one to oppose the criteria. And I know Mr. Adams? Mr. Adams isn't here to defend himself, but if you go back and you listen to the tape, there was a number of board members to speak. Not everyone did speak. Everyone got a chance to speak based on how that conversation unfolded. And before I expected it, a motion was made to approve the criteria. If you go back and you listen to it, we actually didn't discuss the criteria at all. We didn't discuss the criteria at all. We discussed the scoring system, but we didn't go back and actually discuss the criteria at all before the motion was made and approved. I objected and said, no, I'm not going to approve this. And it was suggested by Mr. Adams that if I went back on my own personal time and maybe reviewed the criteria a little bit more, that I could come back another meeting and discuss it. And I said, well, I'm here now. I'm happy to discuss my objections. Or if you prefer, after all, we already voted, if you want to just move on, move on. And he said, I think we'll move on. So I'm here today. I was prepared last meeting to discuss the objections. I had my own criteria that I thought was a pretty good idea that I was never able to present before it was voted on, that I would have liked to have disseminated to everybody else. I made the point then that we were moving too quickly. The problem with the minutes is it says Travis Minch opposed, stating that additional clarification is needed with some of the categories. That didn't occur. Go back to the meeting minutes. I was not given a time at that moment to explain why I had an objection to it. And I had lots of objections. So that's not accurate. And so my suggestion for the correction of the minutes should simply be that a vote was counted. I mean, there's nowhere here it says who, I think, even seconded it, the motion. I think that's probably pretty important to capture in the minutes. But at the very least, it shouldn't say why I opposed, because I didn't get an opportunity to explain that. So just simply strike that language and say, Travis Minch opposed. Take out stating that additional clarification is needed with some of the categories. I would also say that we didn't have much dialogue. It's suggested here after much dialogue. The board approved this selection criteria. We didn't even discuss the criteria. In fact, I think that whole time, which included some interruption in technical capabilities, trying to get some things solved for the recording, that whole time took like 7 minutes. So anyways, again, I don't mean to start the meeting like this, but the way this process is unfolding is tragic in my mind. I think we're missing a huge opportunity. I think we've moved too fast. I think there's going to be process errors that are going to unveil themselves in, well, today and ahead. And I guess that's all I have to say about this.
Can I say something?
Go ahead.
If you'll go back though, Travis, and look at the meeting minutes from February 8th, we did have a fairly extensive discussion on February 8th on the criteria, and the sheet that came back to us at the last meeting incorporated the discussion from that. So, you know, you're correct in that we moved on last month, like 2 months ago, but in February we had quite a lengthy discussion on it.
Can I reply to that?
Sure.
So the February 8th meeting, a criteria was provided to us that I never saw. I don't know where it came from. It had titled LAMP criteria on it. And I attended that meeting. I'm not an insider. So if there's other things being conducted and done that everyone else is aware of, I'm not aware of it. So at February 8th meeting, which was our second meeting, a criteria was provided to all of us. I think everybody remembers, and it said LAMP criteria. And I looked at that spreadsheet and I said, what the heck is this? Did I miss a meeting because we had a sort of introduction meeting? Next thing you know, we're all being handed LAMP criteria. Boom. I thought we were going to talk about, I mean, Elizabeth presented. If you go back to the agenda says Elizabeth's going to present on potential criteria matrices. I'm thinking, great, we're all going to kind of talk about a framework for a matrices. No, that's not what occurred. What occurred was, here's your matrices. You were ready to jump and start modifying. I was like, no way. I can't believe people already not only are embracing this matrices I've never seen, but they're already changing and adding things before we even talk about the structure of the program. That, to me, that was shocking. And again, another example of how we jumped the gun. We should have talked in broad steps. How is this going to be constructed? How do we visualize this? Do we need a marketing strategy? All kinds of broad things, and then whittle it down into criteria. But here we are, we've already approved our criteria. We're now playing catch up. Where do we get the data? How does this process work? Well, it's because if you were to formulate a business plan in the beginning, you would have seen, hey, we need to take care of these steps. Formulating criteria probably could have taken the third or fourth meeting in, but we jumped on the second meeting. Amazing to me that's how this unfolded. And again, I think it was a huge misstep. I think we jumped the gun, and we didn't have consensus on any of those changes made. I remember you turned to me, Shorty, and you said, "You're not taking notes?" I said, "Taking notes? I assume this is going to be captured, and we'll have a chance to evaluate all this stuff the next meeting." No, that's not what happened. All those notes got entered in to our little spreadsheet without consensus, and then in the very next meeting, adopted without any discussion.
All right, let's focus on the minutes first. You're spending a lot of time on a broader topic, the the topic at hand right this moment is the minutes, whether the minutes need to be amended. I think we had a motion and a second, did we not?
So right now you have a motion and a second on the table, and as I understand it, Mr. Minch is trying to amend that motion by having an amendment to item number 5 in the minutes, striking the word much, and then striking the sentence, the clause after oppose that says, starting that additional clarification, stating that additional clarification is needed with some of the categories. And so if that is his motion to amend, he would need a second on
Need a
that.
second to that motion.
So you would now vote on your amendment.
So is there a second to the motion?
Yes.
Okay, that's second? Okay. Any discussion on the motion to amend?
Were there additional amendments to
Yeah,
the minutes?
I mean-
Or was that the specific objection?
I
just, you know, I mean, we got rolling and I just want to make sure we address any of them. If we're going to amend, we might as well do it at once.
No, and I think this is just an example. I didn't go line by line, but this is where this becomes a problem, when you don't have really good minutes and you got one person trying to record minutes, one person leading the meeting. You know, it's too much for staff, honestly. And I think Ed Slavin, who I believe is listening, was the one suggested that maybe the clerk of court should have the meeting minutes or record them. That'll be a good idea. But to answer your
Well,
question, I'm sorry. Yes,
No, yeah.
that's the
I think
only-
what I'm hearing is there's no additional amendments.
And then just an additional comment to your amendment, or proposed amendment. I did not go back and listen to the last meeting prior to reviewing the minutes and like making that comparison. But I do remember your objection being on the basis of not having spent enough time evaluating the criteria. And again, I don't know when that came out, but at some point it did, because that is the impression that I had with your objection. And so in reading that again, I could find myself agreeing with additional clarification being needed in some of the categories that were listed. So, you know, I mean, I'm not opposed to the amendment per se, but it's also just additional information for everybody to understand as we sort of respond.
Yeah, and that actually did occur much further down. I mean, there's
Okay.
a number of items that are discussed. That statement was finally made later on in the meeting. In fact, I think Elizabeth also raised, Elizabeth, you had made raised some concerns about the process later on, and then she was cut off before she could fully explain.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
The minutes aren't meant to capture everything.
No, minutes serve as a summary of the meetings of the board.
Right.
And that's in part why you record the meeting.
Right, that's why you have both.
Exact reason, so
And they should
a
be
board
accurate,
member or anyone
right.
else can go back and listen and
Right. So although we may be missing some detail in the minutes, they're a summary. And I think it's easy to lose sight, I know it is for me to lose sight of that, because that was important, why is that not in there? Well, I understood why.
any more discussion on the motion? All those in favor of the motion indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Okay, the motion's approved.
So that was your amendment, so that now strikes
So now
those
we
two
have to
things. Now you would vote on the
move
motion
for approval
as
of the
amended.
minutes as amended. Do we need a separate motion on
Nope,
that?
yeah, it's the
Okay.
same.
Now, we're voting on the original motion as amended by Travis's motion to amend. All in favor of approval of the minutes as amended, indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay? Okay, the minutes are approved as amended. Now, I'll just tell you, and again, I don't want to belabor this, but Travis has raised the point, he still has concerns about the property evaluation form. We don't have an item on the agenda for further amending the form. I think my recollection is that we were going to do the evaluation of the 3 properties we had information on kind of as a test of the form. And maybe that would provide an opportunity and a forum to discuss if there's any further changes that need to be made to it. Because want to cut off any concerns that somebody might have about the form. Obviously, Travis has concerns about it, but
So you're saying, go ahead and rate the 3 properties, and then Travis can bring up, as an example, maybe we should have this in here, or
And
maybe
there-
we shouldn't have this.
right, we don't have an item on the agenda for further evaluation of the form. We can, again, depending on how structured we want to be, typically you would have something agendaed for that purpose if you wanted to do that. Again, so the public has notice it's going to be discussed and can do that. Again, my view was when we get to this kind of test run of the evaluation form, that would be an opportunity to talk about what's good and bad about it, and if the board sees fit, we can put it on the agenda at the next meeting to dissect it further.
And I do recall that being consensus of, hey, we gotta start somewhere, let's keep moving the ball down the field, and we can always go back and amend what the system that we're using.
And then we knew it wasn't static.
Yeah. Are we just speaking for this? Or do we-
I'll recognize you for a minute more.
Yeah, I think, I get what y'all are saying. I think we belabor that point about let's get something approved so we can move forward. I'm not sure what exactly is the rush, because I feel like you're jeopardizing the entire program by designing it poorly from the start. I think we need to go back to Elizabeth's original presentation, which I found something to aspire to. I found it inspirational. I think Elizabeth probably has the best idea of how to formulate a program, and I don't think we followed it at all. Elizabeth, I hope you will speak up. I'm not suggesting you're fully in agreement with me, but just based on what I have viewed, I think Elizabeth's guidance in how to actually design this program would be a much better idea to follow.
Thanks, Travis. I think I was anticipating having some of this discussion once we reached item 4 and started actually going through each of our experiences going through these criteria. So I'd like to continue to have that discussion then.
All right, with that, I'm going to move on to item number 2 on the agenda, which was finalization of the property nomination form. There was discussion on that at our last meeting, and there were, I believe, changes approved. And my assumption is the form that we have here was intended to capture those changes. And so we need to take a look at it and determine if we're satisfied with it. This is the nomination form. Has everybody had a chance to look at it?
Yes.
Any comments or questions on it?
I think the question is, for me, is like, I understand this is an initial step. At some point, I would think there's some maybe more detailed application information submitted. I don't know if I'm going back to my comprehensive plan review days. But I know when I reviewed comprehensive plan amendments, we had an application that would be filled out that had the applicant answer questions on how their proposed amendment matched up our criteria. This is a one-page form. I think everybody thought that was a great idea. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But I'm still trying to bridge the gap between a one-page form that doesn't talk about our criteria with the actual time of reviewing the criteria. I think we've got a gap in the process.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that this form is, again, just kind of a start of the process. I mean, it's not the end point, and I presume that this gets a property before the board and the staff for purposes of perhaps answering some of those questions
Well,
that Travis is bringing up.
sorry about that.
No, go ahead.
And then does the note to attach the page of explanation why you think the property is an excellent addition to the conservation lands sufficient in your mind, or you're guiding more toward just for clarification's sake? Because in my mind, okay, here's the page proposal of how that would work.
Not at all, yeah, I don't think this is sufficient to match up with your criteria. I think more appropriately would be an application that says, explain to us how your property, and I'm going off of our approved criteria, which I don't even really care for, but, please explain how your property protects from sea level rise. Is your property suitable for grant funding? I mean, again, just going off the list, how does your property expand existing resource-based properties? What kind of public support do you have for your project? I think you put that burden on the applicant. I mean, I know we talked about us kind
I
of
disagree with that.
going through.
Okay, one at a time.
Yeah, sorry.
And I know, JP, you had suggested that maybe you had a sort of proprietary database of things you could kind of check or such.
Hold on, one at a time.
Yep, and so we all could kind of pivot off of that. I think it was suggested that was a great idea. I think it's a horrific idea. Not saying anything about you, JP, or your information, I'm sure it's great. But having data sources, having the applicant provide information to us to review, having staff that says, hey, well, we've got this own data source. And that's how the process in my mind should work. Kind of like a comprehensive plan amendment. I don't know if has anybody reviewed comprehensive plan amendments? Yeah, okay. So you know how that process works, right? You get an application, you review it against the county's policies. Seems to me that this process could work this same way versus kind of having one board member provide material for all of us to pivot off of, or for us to just take in this and then start scoring. I don't know how the heck I'm going to score these properties. I don't know, what data am I supposed to look at?
All right, Jamie?
I looked at lots of other counties and cities that have nomination forms, as I'm sure, I know you're familiar with them as well, Shorty, but the standard is a very short nomination form because you have people with tremendous resources and you have people that can barely use a computer, they're going to be nominating. And so I can't think, in my mind, having them be responsible or having to pay to have somebody like a consultant write up the stuff that would be necessary to meet our whatever you want to call it, meet all these things. It's going to be incumbent upon them. The more information they put in there, if they read this, which they'll have access to, the property valuation, or whatever it looks like, they're going to write in here things that they think are going to get them more points, just like any good grant writer would do. But you're going to have people literally that we're going to be lucky if they even fill out the form. And so the more basic the form that gets it into the queue is, to me, the purpose of the nomination. That's my thought on what the nomination form should be. How we do it internally is a good point of discussion. That I agree with you, Travis, and we can talk about that more. You're right, it shouldn't be incumbent upon one or two people to provide all the information, nor should be incumbent upon staff to do all of the background research on a piece of property. I mean, you're going to do a cultural resource survey, I guarantee it. I know that, I understand that, but the natural resources stuff is a whole different component. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. I think we need to keep this as basic as reasonable.
Any other thoughts?
I think that in the original criteria for membership here, everybody has a complementary roles. And so I think there's a lot of benefit in looking to someone for environmental and, for different things. And I mean, if JB tells me something's environmentally sensitive, I've worked with him for 20 years. I'm going to say, yeah, okay, So it's, I think that rather individually reinventing the wheel, I think we're here as a group whose independent strengths make us stronger. That's all.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I just wanted, speaking to the form and the simplicity of the form, I think the importance of the simplicity is not to exclude anyone who may want to nominate a property. I think even if all they have is their tax parcel ID and a little bit of information about the property, that should warrant us reviewing the property. So I will agree that this needs to be as simple as possible, but I also think, Travis, you're speaking to that intermediary step that we need to figure out in terms of how we are getting this information and where it's coming from, and that we're, you know, looking at similar sources. So I do agree with you there.
I think we're going to have a lot more discussion about that when we
Yeah.
do
We get to four.
exercise
Yeah,
earlier
exactly.
later today. Any other comments? And Travis, I'll give you one more shot.
No, I think Elizabeth nailed it. That's my concern. I agree. I want it to be easy for someone to put in that application. One page is great. I think we're missing that critical second step. And I don't think we've discussed that yet at all. I think it's probably very important.
Do I hear a motion on approval of the form?
So moved.
Motion from Elizabeth.
Second.
Do I- Second from Shorty. Any discussion? All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Okay, we have approved the nomination form. All right, the third item on our agenda is a staff report on cultural resources.
I have a 4-slide presentation, kind of on my role a bit. Where do I?
File explores it, if you're
Excuse me, Chair. Before you go back, I want to make sure, since you actually took a vote on the
Wait,
form,
are you
if there
signing?
is any public comment related to the
Yeah, I
form.
need to sign in.
Go ahead.
Mr. Slavin?
It's, go ahead.
Mr. Slavin?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. No, I have no public comment on this item, but thank you for asking.
Thank you,
Thank you
sir.
for doing this. Appreciate it. Thank you.
As Elizabeth pointed out, I skipped over item number 1 on the agenda, but we'll take that up after we hear our presentation on cultural resources.
So this presentation is just going to be a little bit about my role and what I do. That way you can understand this process a little bit better. And then we'll be going over any questions you might have.
Password.
Do it again. I figure it would be good to have a definition of what proactive means. All right. Where is, right here. All right, as everybody knows, my name is Trey Asner. I'm the Cultural Resource Coordinator for St. Johns County. Here's a picture of one of our most important cultural resources here, Alpine Grove. Shorty has been involved with that property for a very, very long time. She knows a lot about it. So what are cultural resources here? Cultural resources are tangible remains of human past activities. These include buildings, structures, objects, prehistoric archaeological sites, and cultural landscapes. And you can see on this slide a variety of different photographs, and they're kind of arranged from oldest to most recent here. So on the bottom left, you can see some pottery shards and footed vessels that were recovered in 1894 in Racy Point by an archaeologist. Those are some of our cultural resources here, artifacts, tiny objects. And then to the right, we have the old Spanish chimney site, which was built around 1671. It was part of a barracks structure that housed quarrymen quarrying coquina for the fort. And then to the right, in the Switzerland area, we have LaVenture Grove, a structure that was built around 1880. Now, this is what most people think about when they think about historic sites, old buildings. But if you look at the top right, we have that blue bird that greets people at the Villano Beach Pier. That too is a cultural resource. It's representative of the post-war tourist industry here in St. Johns County. So what are my responsibilities in this role? Part of my responsibilities are identifying, protecting, and managing St. Johns County's cultural resources as best as I possibly can, and maintaining an inventory of them. That includes those that have been designated as significant cultural resources, county landmarks, and resources that haven't been designated but are still important representations of our tangible past. Now, I've arranged in two categories the kind of work that I do in my role. Being reactive, let's say, towards applications, and being proactive, trying to get ahead to protect resources before they are initially threatened. So part of the reactive role, doing development review projects, such as reviewing applications for new construction in the form of pre-apps, commercial, residential applications, and they could be small from, the building department sends me like, hey, this awning's going to be replaced, review it, to, there's this large development that's planned on a 300-acre parcel of land, and reviewing demolitions to see, are these structures significant, and should they be documented before demolition? Should cultural resource mitigation plan be ordered to try and understand the history of the property before it's lost? And in reviewing applications, I may order a CRAS report, a cultural resource assessment survey, where the property is surveyed, its social history is looked into, the history of the property, how it changed hands, if there was any historic structures on the property. And the way we judge that is based on knowledge that might be gained through photographs or maps, but also our archaeological probability model, which takes into account, the proximity to water bodies and the elevations to determine, is there a chance that Native Americans lived on that site? Are there artifacts on that site? In terms of the proactive side of things, I provide historic preservation guidance to the public and the staff here. So I might get a member of the county staff from Parks and Recs asking me about property and how to best preserve the historic structure on the site. Or the public may call me curious about my role and about any advice I could give them on to best preserve their historic structure. I'm the county liaison to the Public Cultural Resource Review Board, and that board designates structures as significant cultural resources, which is an honorary designation, or a significant cultural resource with landmark status, which ensures that there's a review process if that owner of that property wanted to change anything about it, the site, its environs. And I may be involved with grant projects. They can vary depending on my creativity here. Right now I'm assisting in a current grant project, a survey of historic structures on A1A that are 50 years or older. And I think it's important with this role that I engage with the public to let them know about the historic resources management section, my role here, so that they know there's a contact person at the county to discuss historic cultural resources, and assisting with any programs that may be historically inclined. This position here is really what I make of it beyond development review. The previous people in this position have been archaeologists. I'm a historic preservationist, so I find it important that we recognize our historic built environment, since that's what the public sees, especially on county properties. And some of the research tools that I use in assessing a historic property, ArcMaps, which is our GIS map with all these different layers showing like the archaeological probability model, the location of surveyed sites that have been evaluated and have a Florida master site file on them, information on specific structures. I use historic aerials, maps, photos, and I also like to interview people who have been long enough in this county that they might have something, some detail that's not written anywhere, but might provide some great insight into a historic property. And in the background here, you can see a map from the mid-19th century of the St. Johns County area. It's a detail of a larger Florida map, and you can see how kind of undeveloped St. Johns County was at that time. Would you like me to maybe go over the criteria for a significant cultural resource or landmark?
I would.
Okay. So I brought a copy of the Land Development Code, specifically my section here, and the criteria for a significant cultural resource is the same for a landmark. However, a property owner may not want to pursue a landmark status because that they would need a certificate of appropriateness for work done on the property, depending on the level of work. So a property usually has to be 50 years of age or older, and it has to satisfy at least 3 of the following attributes of integrity. And then integrity is very important in historic preservation. Location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. In terms of feeling, that's a little bit more abstract. It's about feeling like you have a connection to the past in that space. It's providing a sense of place. Think about downtown St. Augustine. You have hundreds of years of history represented by structures built in the 18th century, the 20th century, the 19th century. So there's a sense of that history by being in that environment, as opposed to, let's say, being at the Avenues Mall, where it's only like 1990s. There's no history there. And it also must satisfy one or more of the following criteria. Associated in a significant way with the life of a person of recognized importance. The site of a historic event with significant effect upon St. Johns County, the state of Florida, or the nation. Exemplifies a historic, cultural, political, economic, or social trend of St. Johns County, the state of Florida, or the nation. Embodies distinguishing characteristics of an architectural style, period, or method of construction. Is the work of an architect or builder whose work has significantly influenced the development of St. Johns County, the state of Florida, or the nation. Contains elements of design, detail, materials, or craftsmanship of outstanding quality, or represents a significant innovation or adaptation to the Florida environment. Has value as a building that is recognized for the quality of its architecture and that has retained sufficient features showing its architectural significance. Has yielded or is likely to yield archaeological information or artifacts important in prehistory or history. Is a geographically definable area or neighborhood united by culture, architectural styles, or physical development, which has historic or cultural significance in the community. It's quite a criteria list right there. And it's important to note that cultural resources is in historic structures or objects. They're inextricably tied to the environments they're in, such as, let's say, a late 19th century Orange Grove farmhouse. It is part of that site. So the preservation of the site itself, that environment, is also important to the preservation of the historic structure. And that can be considered like a cultural landscape. A landscape that may not appear like it has any physical, tangible reminders of the past on it, but may have a history of Native American occupation, or its use as an old turpentine operation, or Orange Grove. A cultural landscape has a history of interaction with humankind, essentially. I just wanted to cover that real quick. So, any comments or questions?
You have a responsibility, Mr. Chairman, can I ask?
Oh, yes, please, I'm sorry.
You have responsibilities only on property in St. Johns County. What about incorporated areas?
Not in any designated municipality, so not in St. Augustine. So in unincorporated St. Johns County is under my review. And that's not just for properties that are St. Johns County owned, but private property as well, in the case where they have applied for any type of construction projects. It goes through development review, it goes through my office to make sure that they don't harm any historic resources on site.
What about state and federal property?
That's not in my purview. So that would be up to that would be at the state level, the Division of Historic Resources. So I'm just local. I'm a local yokel.
Travis?
Question. I think it was on the previous slide, you had a reactive versus proactive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You had made the comment about in certain cases you order a CRAS.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean they order? Does that mean you order it from the private landowner? Does that mean that you prepare it, you order it from a consultant? Who's actually paying for and preparing?
The applicant would have to pay for the CRAS report.
Okay,
Mhm.
and I guess to that point, because that's what I expected, what is the criteria for you ordering a CRAS report?
It's kind of open-ended depending on what property I'm looking at. The archaeological probability model is used as a guide, but it's not concrete. So if I could bring up the model real quick. So here you can see a view from ArcMaps right here. Oh, sorry. The connection's kind of slow here. You lag. So this giant green square right here represents Fort Piccolata, the fort that was there in the 18th century and a fort that was built during the Civil War era in the 19th century. So if we bring up the archaeological probability model here, you can see the red area represents a high probability of archaeological resources. The medium probability represents, of course, the medium, and then this light kind of yellowish color here, greenish, represents low probability of historic resources. And this isn't entirely accurate. It's just meant as a guide because it only takes into account elevation and proximity to water bodies here. In terms of ordering a CRAS report, I would take into account how close is it to shell middens, historic Native American campsites, which will also appear. And those are usually found during research, during the research process and the creation of other CRAS reports. But let's say it's in a low probability area here, but through studying a historic map, I might see that there was a historic house here in the early 19th century. I may use that map as my basis for ordering a CRAS report.
So follow-up question then. Can you zoom out just so we can get a perspective of how many high and medium low properties there are in the county?
Mm-hmm.
And Jan, I think you may know it, correct me if I'm wrong, I think your predecessor said anything in medium probability or more had to have the private landowner pay for a cultural resources survey?
Well, as Trey has mentioned, it depends. We use an analysis tool. So medium to high, we typically would require a CRAS report to be created. But let's say in that medium area, if I already have a parking lot on it, of course, there would not be a need for a CRAS report. So we do take into account a lot of other layers within the GIS model and make our determination that way. But typically, yes, medium to high would require it.
Yeah, and I kind of recall that because my neighbor was building a swimming pool in the backyard and actually had to pay for a $2,000 cultural resource assessment survey in addition to their swimming pool. I'm not sure what was it's not really public access, right, to the cultural resources
That is on
found.
Neck Road.
That would be off of Guana Drive, yeah.
There was a burial mound in the vicinity, so we wanted to make sure we weren't digging someone up.
Yeah, I think we did one on Palm Valley as well. I'm not sure what was close there. I don't think there was a shell netting. But, so yeah, I guess I'm just, and it looks like there's a ton of medium high on the map. So that's a lot of surveys for the public to perform at their expense.
And as we said, there's a lot of variables that we take into account when, we order a crash report, and I take into account whether the benefit of the crash report is worth it, as in terms of the cost to the applicant. So as Jan said, we look at if there's been prior construction on that site, has it already been cleared? Have there been crash reports ordered for neighboring properties that say, hey, we probably have already acquired information through this report here. No need to put this applicant through the process of acquiring their own crash report for their individual property. And
So tying this back to then what we're doing, because I know we do have a cultural resource line, I think we have 5 points allocated to it. We can't necessarily use that map then to know for sure whether let's say we have a parcel that we are looking at preserving. We can't necessarily rely on this map to say, yes, indeed, if we preserve that site, we are in fact preserving archaeological and historic structures, because it may be the case that it's just high probable or medium probability, but nothing actually exists there. Is that fair to say?
that is fair to say. And there's a Florida Master site file website archive that has a list of all the crash reports that have been essentially compiled for the construction of subdivisions. And that can be used as a resource to determining whether there's actual sites that have been reviewed that have archaeological remains on them when assessing a property. And looking at, let's take off the archaeological probability model right here, and you can see did I not take it off? Oh. There we go. You can see the green squares and circles which demonstrate where there has been a crash survey performed or where there's a recognized historical site of some kind. And some are important, some are significant, some are not. Some of these sites, it may just say, hey, this was the site of a turpentine operation at the turn of the century, but it's been evaluated as not significant, but it appears as part of the data set here to let you take that into account when you're determining what's needed for a site.
So just to clarify, so do you do the cultural resource assessment survey for us then? Because JB, didn't you suggest that he would?
I have the data. Can I respond?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have the data. He's the man, but I have the data. So when I talk about it, I'm going to say it was a high probability. It is a high probability area by the model, or there is a known site, in the area. But that's your expert.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we know if there is a site or not? If it's a high probability area but it hasn't been surveyed, and the person applies, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we know?
We probably wouldn't know in terms of archaeological artifacts because someone would have to go out there and dig.
Who pays for that?
In this particular case, for this nomination, I'm not really sure who would pay for that. That's not written out in any of the code. So that's something that that would have to be worked out. You know, I can do research for the board in terms of looking at historical maps, documents, providing a social context, historical context for an area, but in terms of doing an archaeological analysis of the property,
You don't have staff to do that. I understand.
No.
Makes sense.
In the past, if it's something the county's interested in acquiring and looking at acquiring, the county pays for someone to do an archaeological assessment.
A phase one.
Mhm,
Part of the due diligence.
mhm.
Well, I have one
That can be very
question,
expensive.
a question kind of process. What role does SHPO play in this? You know, in my experience, mostly on the environmental side, the applicant writes a letter to SHPO, and they write a letter back, and if the letter says we don't have any information indicating presence of historical or cultural resources, it stops there. So how do you interact with them?
SHPO, by the way, is State Historic Preservation Officer, for those that don't. We all use all these terrible acronyms. Sorry.
you know, the State Historic Preservation Office might have influence if it is a grant-related project, or if it's a project which, for some reason, it's decided that the state needs to be involved with. But for the most part, it would just be county, it would just be myself.
I'll chime in on that if you don't mind, Chair.
Please.
So basically, that's for the county permit. Most of these projects will also need a state authorization. And so through the state authorization, it would go through SHPO. And I would imagine if the county's ever requested the CRAS, that the CRAS would serve as the survey for the SHPO.
I guess what I was getting at, if SHPO says we don't have any records of any historic resources on a county decision, land use decision, if you felt like that you had information, would that still be required? Further inquiry, going behind the SHPO letter, I guess, is where I'm going.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm gonna. It's a little off track, so don't worry about it. I'll talk to you about it.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions on cultural resources or the process, county forms? You look like you've got a question.
No, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Trey. We appreciate it. All right. Now we're going to go back to item number 1. Which I missed, which is discussion of a resiliency recommendation letter to the Board of County Commissioners. I believe we discussed this at the meeting 2 months ago, and there was interest in doing that, and I think staff was going to draft a letter for consideration by the board, if I recall correctly.
Yes, but something we just found out as of in May, that the county received a grant to do a resiliency survey, and the staff member involved with that is Wesley Woodward, and we don't have all the information on this yet. Like I said, we as environmental just became aware of this, so maybe in a future meeting we could have Ms. Woodward sit in and kind of explain what she'll be looking over for the county's resiliency project, and what the grant kind of wants to go over. And the grant was for $500,000, just to give some more information
Not
on that.
insubstantial.
Yeah. And also I can give the board the contact information for her if you have any questions after this meeting. And but like I said, we can look into bringing her in for a meeting to kind of go over that.
Would the board be interested in having, is it Ms. Woodward, perhaps come and talk about what the plans are with the grant the county got?
They got the grant, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, so if you would perhaps staff could convey to her, go right ahead.
What does the resiliency program look at? Just sea level rise?
That is the main focus, but as far as the details, that is something I'm not aware of. And like I said, this is something we just found out last month and haven't had much discussion with Ms. Woodward about it to this point.
I think it would be really helpful to get the information to see how what she's doing fits in with our criteria and what we're looking at and how those two can match up. Travis, did you have a?
I mean, I'm okay with that. I guess my only hesitation is I feel like we've got a lot of work to do and it takes a lot of time and we've only got, so many meetings and so much time on meetings. So that'd be my only hesitation.
Anybody else have any concerns or other viewpoints? Okay. Any public comment on the resiliency topic? Okay, hearing none. I think we have a consensus that we would like to hear from Ms. Woodward, if she's able, perhaps at our August meeting. All right, now for the fun time. We'll move on to item number 4 on our agenda, which is evaluation of the 3 properties that we were provided with information on, perhaps going back 2 meetings or more ago. That's State Road 312, State Road 207, County Road 13 properties. And I believe we're going to have a report from JB.
You want to start with that?
Or did staff want to offer some comments first?
What do you want to do?
Here, let me just be signed back in.
I'd like to ask a question before we start, if I could, please.
Sure.
Or a series of questions. And this is not specific to these pieces of property. This is more of a process question. So we have 3 pieces of property, right? And 3 willing buyers or sellers. So far, I'm correct?
I believe that's correct.
And we got 3 signed nomination forms.
I don't know if they're actual forms, like this, signed. I don't know.
Well, no, I don't think the public's seen that yet.
Yeah. Or any facsimile.
Whose
of that, I'm not
responsibility
sure.
is it to get this nomination form signed?
I'm sorry?
Whose responsibility is it to get the landowner to sign the nomination form?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I had understood in the discussion prior, and I'm just telling you what I have heard, is that that not just staff, but board members, the board member becomes aware, because I think we, in prior discussions, consider ourselves all part of this process and ambassadors, that if there's a property that we become aware of, that an owner might be interested in selling or willing to entertain an offer, that we would kind of spearhead that process. Otherwise, there are folks who come to the county, and that may be the case with these 3, I'm not sure, and say, I've got a piece of property, I'm interested, and then they collect information. So I'm telling you what I have heard in the meetings that I've attended.
So how we know these properties are available is we either find out personally or somebody comes to the county. Is that the only 2 ways?
I think that what we had agreed on, and that was part of this form process, was that by signing this form, the owner is indicating that they are a willing seller.
Okay, so then the county does an appraisal of each piece of property, is that correct?
No.
Yes,
No matter what?
yes, we would have to, before we can do anything, we would have to first reach out. Sorry, this is Jan Brewer, may I?
Yeah, Jan, I'm sorry, Jan.
Before we would do anything on a piece of property, we would have to make sure it's a willing seller, so they would have to sign a willing seller form. And then I think then it would go back to you, the board, okay, they all signed a willing seller, you're gonna have to rank them, or you could either rank them prior to that. Because eventually we will have to order an appraisal and make sure that of the appraised value, you can't pay $2 million for a $10,000 piece of property. So we'd have to have an appraisal, and this would all go through our real estate division here in St. Johns County.
We're not going to appraise every property nominated.
No.
We would rank the properties, and when we got to the point of focusing, at that point, we would have, obviously, before there's any offer or anything else, there would have to be an
Right.
appraisal.
Right. We would have to hone in on the properties because again, if you land on 10 properties, we could not afford 10 appraisals. And the money will be coming out of the LAMP money. So it'll be coming out of the money that you get annually for this activity.
Pay for the appraisals?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm going to get to it in a second. I'm just let Jimmy finish first.
One more question then. So we're going to evaluate 3 pieces of property today. Do we wait till the end of the year and we got 10 properties, then we tell the county, Board of County Commissioners, these are the 3 recommended?
My understanding is that we are preparing a list, a total list, are we not, to submit to the county by October?
So it is an annual list. And force rank, 1 to 10.
1 to whatever.
The top 5.
The other ones, okay.
But all the pieces of property we have to force rank in here before we can come to the top 5.
Correct. Travis?
Yeah, so I would suggest, to answer the question about, whether we got a sign form or not, seems pretty simple to me, just to ask staff that before it's brought to us, that they ensure that the application is complete. I think they do that with a million other type of applications, so I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, Jan or Sean, but I think just a simple check to make sure that we've got a signed form before we consider it is probably a pretty quick, easy process step for us. And that way, we're not having something put before the board that staff hasn't reviewed and really put on the agenda. So that would be my suggestion there. As far as the list of properties, again, I know we're probably going to be diving into a number of topics kind of all over the place, but when I went back to read the ordinance, and I think it was Jen Lombeck, I'm not sure, is that the right name? Jen Lombeck?
Lomberg.
Lomberg, okay. I'm still learning people. She had pointed out that the task that we have before us is to submit 5 properties to the BCC as our recommendation. And, our criteria here, if anybody has that in front of them, you look at the footnote, unless maybe I've got an old version, it says properties scored 66 or over get placed on the BCC annual recommendation list. So I think we discussed that there's probably a pretty likely chance that we may have more than 5 that actually get over 66. And yet, this says that we should admit any and all over 66 to the county commission, yet our ordinance says that we should only submit 5. And when I read that ordinance, I looked at it a little bit further. I actually went up to the next line, and it said, let me find it here, it was in section 8, if you've got the ordinance in front of you. It says, the Land Conservation Board shall recommend to the Board of County Commissioners properties, acquisition, and conservation based solely on the land acquisition and conservation selection criteria and ranking matrices. Again, if you go back to the last meeting, I know you remember this because we kind of went back and forth on that. Remember when we talked about whether certain properties could score 80 and others could score 70, yet we were going to put the 70 in front of the 80 because of some other criteria, and that criteria wasn't captured in our approved criteria form? I'm not sure where other members expected to have that decision made from, but this is supposed to be a public sort of in the sunshine decision-making process. The ordinance says that we should use this to rank, solely this to rank, and that those that score the highest would logically be the ones that then would be recommended to the BCC.
Mr. Vice Chair.
JB?
I think what you might be mistaking was we've talked about how there could be a list of 5, and it could be that number 5 gets the one that gets bought because it's the one that's most available and we have the money for, even though it's not the highest ranking. So that because we did talk about, I know we talked about that, because that's the reality of land acquisition is the one we rank, supposedly, I guess, want the most, we'd be lucky if that's the one we actually end up seeing purchased because of all sorts of reasons. So if that's what you're saying, then it's that, yes, you're right, a 70 could get bought over an 80.
No, and what we discussed, again, I would recommend everybody go back to that audio recording, because that's where you really get to hear what was said. It's not captured in the minutes. It was suggested as if we should recommend properties that had scored lower to the BCC. Not that they were going to get purchased before. Listen to the recording. Again, just pointing out the process, challenges. I'm not sure if this note still exists on the matrices. I think we need to revisit this and amend this note.
Okay, well, we'll have an opportunity to do that. Any other questions or comments before
Yeah,
we
just
start
one more.
talking
So
about-
there'll be a cultural assessment of these properties, or do we look at GIS and make our own?
I think that it would be a good idea if there's any properties that you're thinking about nominating, to ask my office, email me. I can see what research I can dig up on the property for you and share it with the board. And if it goes a step further, just based on information that I heard earlier from Shorty, the county can perhaps order a crash report on property. But
When we initially look at this property, we have no idea if there's a cultural.
no, because you wouldn't have access to the GIS probability map. We can share with you information and findings, and crash reports have been filed online, but because that data is so sensitive in regards to the location of important sites where there may be artifacts, it can't be made public. But the goal of the Land Board, as I understand it, is to focus on natural resources that may perhaps have a cultural resource component. And so if there's any information that you guys hear that makes you think that there might be, feel free to swing it through me. Or if you just want me to check, even if there doesn't appear to be any cultural resource component to the property, feel free to contact me. And I know he has historical maps at his disposal. I have historical maps at my disposal. We'll do our due diligence and evaluate the property as best we can so the board can have that knowledge when selecting properties.
Okay, maybe JB, this is directed. Is there also a natural resources assessment done on the property?
Well,
Yeah, please. I'm sorry.
the only way to really do one is get your boots on the ground.
So-
I did not have permission from the landowner to get on any of these properties. So what we're going to see briefly is a series of, this is the best I could do at the time, is a series of historical aerials, which kind of gives you an idea of some of the land use real quickly. And then there are a series of natural resource things through the Florida Natural Areas Inventory and others that I have all those, and I put all those out there as well as the archaeological predictive model. And if anything was tagged, then yes,
Okay, so who on this board does that if you move away or never come back to a meeting?
Elizabeth
Well,
probably be the
what-
next likely. No.
If I can comment on that.
Yeah, I didn't, what was the question?
If JB doesn't ever
Okay.
show up again, who does
Yeah.
a natural resource assessment
Yeah.
for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point I would make is I think a lot of this is going to have to come from some type of initial analysis from the staff that is going to be provided to us.
I think we need a battle book that
As
tells
a-
me exactly
as a
the steps.
baseline.
We're not going to have perfect
Yeah.
consultant level information
but-
on probably most of the properties we look at, if not all of them, simply because the owners in most instances are not going to hire a team of environmental consultants to do a delineation of wetlands and a wildlife survey and those types of things, because they don't want to invest the money because they want to sell the property, I guess, or they don't want to find something they don't want to find. And I don't know that we could spend all of the money we have to buy land on doing that kind of work and never be able to buy a piece of land. So there are a lot of publicly available resources, National Wetlands Inventory and mapping and other things that the county has, and SHPO data and data that the county has. And, again, in many instances, we'll be able to get some additional data from the landowner, but, I mean, I don't want us to have the illusion that we're going to have some, with that perhaps a developer would get before they would buy a piece of property to develop. We're not necessarily going to have all of that.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand the process we go through here.
And I can tell you that even the state agencies, will spend tens of millions of dollars on property that won't necessarily have that level of information, so.
It's sort of a likelihood kind of a thing, and then, it just sort of gives you a starting place as far as ranking. And I mean, I look at it like it's not, the initial ranking doesn't need to be carved in stone. It sort of gives us, no way, we don't want that, or, ooh, hey, this looks interesting, and then it's up to us. We do have a budget. We can decide if we want to hire somebody to go further with that, if it looks like it's something that we're interested in.
So we have ability to spend county money?
Well, I'm not sure that we have the ability to tell the county, you will do X, Y, or Z. We can ask for
We
that
just recommend.
assistance.
Is that what you just suggested? I mean, we can spend a little money on due diligence, is that
No,
correct?
we can't. It's not up here still.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
not correct.
I'm not sure, I don't know. I would ask Keely that question.
I would
No,
think-
I'm sure we're not.
We have before.
That's up to the commission.
It's something I can look into.
Yeah.
If the commission has approved something to move forward, then yes, you can do that, but we would have to go to the commission to have it.
I think the question was within the budget for the ramp, for which I guess presumably is for land acquisition, could some of those monies be expended for due diligence items?
I think, Keely, I think we would have to,
I think due diligence is going to come after the fact. You're still in your initial phase where you're doing your ranking and consideration. And so that would come with
I
any
agree.
purchase from the county that they would make on an acquisition of a property. There would be a due diligence as you get closer to the sale. I think you're still in the initial phase of just assessment.
But if we needed more information to make that assessment,
So that would be a case-by-case basis, and then
Yeah.
we would have to consider it. But I don't think it's anything you could authorize. You would have
Oh,
to
yeah,
go
yeah.
through
Yeah.
to the county Board of Commissioners as a request.
So we don't have a credit card that we can just
No.
No.
tell
No.
XYZ consultants, we want you to do.
oh gosh, especially XYZ consultants, no.
They're horrible.
So,
Travis?
and I think this raises a point that it was made in an earlier meeting, which is the importance of having good data to kind of, drive this whole process. I think that meeting, or that was mentioned by somebody in maybe the first meeting. But nonetheless, to Jimmy's point, I can tell you when I'm going through a due diligence process for my clients, we are very meticulous on what we order when we do it, because something like an archaeological survey, I think you can attest to this,
I can
for
attest to
something
it.
50 acres or more, going to be pretty expensive. And so I can tell you when I'm advising my clients, when I'm looking at purchasing land, we don't order an archaeological survey first. In fact, I've got an entire process that I give my clients and say, hey, you're going to want to start with this first, then you're going to, if this checks out, then you move to this, then you move to this, right? Am I right? And one of those first things is title. I know you mentioned title because you wouldn't believe how many properties have title issues. And you go start spending money on environmental assessments, archaeological assessments, all kinds of stuff, and then you find out you got a title issue that you could have figured out with $125. So, to Jimmy's point, process, how are we doing this, how are we doing our due diligence matters. The data sources matters, because if we're going to talk about cultural, are we going to just rely on the high probability map? Maybe we say, yeah, that makes sense at this stage because it's early.
I think maybe I said it, and I want to clarify myself, Chair, is that due diligence isn't this phase that you're out. Due diligence is when it's on a list and it's going to be purchased.
I
And
use
it-
due diligence in a broader sense.
I know, and so I think you're just doing an assessment of property. Is it something is something the county wants? Is it desirable? Now, you could get to the end, have your 5 on a list, and then come to find out it's a contaminated site. It just comes off the list.
Elizabeth?
So, and I think in the context of cultural resources specifically, you know, when we're going to be ranking these properties, when a property comes to us, if we're going to be basing a decision off of that, it's probably because we already know of the cultural or historic significance. Someone's going to say there was an old fort here, or there was something here, and that's what we're going to be basing a lot of that decision off of. If we don't know that information, I'm just speaking from my experience from evaluating lots of properties, we're just not going to know that information. And so we're going to keep going, and if the property is worthy on 10 other merits, then we're just going to keep going. It might have a medium probability, high probability, you know, so be it. But none of the due diligence in the title, surveys, ESA sense happens until the commission approves it and the acquisition process starts.
I think that makes 100% sense, 100% sense. And so our criteria, I mean, again, when we would actually apply this and we've got that cultural line, I mean, what we're going to be essentially saying, if we've got 5 points to grant, is there are either known cultural resources, cultural or historic resources, or there's unknown. And if there are some, then we'll probably say, hey, these are pretty cool historic resources. It gets a 4 or 5. Oh, these are historic resources, they're known, but maybe it's not as valued by the board here, and we give it a 2. But it's not a 0 because there are known. To me, that makes perfect sense.
Want to start?
All right, with that,
While can you go ahead and get the PowerPoint actually running?
Yeah.
And if you would be so kind as to click for me, I'd appreciate it.
Yes.
By the way, Brevard County is an example. When they get their ranking, they have a separate group that goes out and assesses each property on field trips that are not affiliated with the committee because they can't be. I mean, they're a subgroup, but they're not appointed by the commission, so they actually have this group of volunteers that go out and assess, but they're on a much bigger scale. So, all right, so Anastasia Lakes parcel, and you're gonna go through this real quickly. It's 49 acres. This is what it looks like in a 2021 aerial. Next, please. All I'm going to do is, like I did for all of these, is go through a bunch that was missing on top, get you an idea of what it looked like. This is an easy one because this is 100% salt marsh. If you remember where that one is, it's right there next to Anastasia Lakes property. So you can just go through these aerials fairly quickly. It's salt marsh. No. And the last one, this next one, this, that one. That puts it in context with other natural areas around it. You have the state-owned on the far bottom left, Fish Island Preserve. The blue is a city property called Fish Island Road. Red is the property we're looking at, and the rest of it is Anastasia State Parks. That just puts it into context. I didn't put the county parks on there because the county parks are really more of a the ones that we're talking about are recreation that I would put on there. So that's, go on the next, just go through this real quickly because we've got a lot of time to cover. The Moose-Salem property, which is on 207, current image. One thing you can notice real quickly is that it looked like it was heavily grazed. You can see the big, long, narrow strip of hardwood swamp that comes right up through it. And then these are flatwoods that would have been fairly heavily grazed and burned back in the 40s. Next. 10 years later after that, and then what they did is they started to come in and they planted slash pines, and so this is being bedded and ready for planting. So that was in 1971. In 1980, keep going. And then the next one is really fascinating. I don't know if you can see it very well from where you are, but they came in, the owners, whoever they were, came in prior to 2010 and clear-cut the entire hardwood swamp. And then also cut all this, and then they looked like they did what was called a seed cut in the pine plantation, and then they replanted. So just so you know, that's what was done. It was blitzkrieged prior to 2010.
and then the entire site replanted and
Except for the wetlands, yes.
Okay.
And an entire site pre-planted in pines, or planted afterwards in pines. And then next is and it's real jumpy, is a digital elevation model. So this is the elevations of the property. So you can see where the wet areas are, you can see where the higher areas are, and so forth, just to give you an idea. You can see where the ditches are, you can see where just about everything is. Next. And then just to put it in context, the Plaquemine St. Augustine Rail Trail, the county's New Salem Trailhead, and then where the property lies there on 207. All right, next. This is the McCullough Creek, or I guess it's Clark is the family that owns it. Next, please. And really nothing much has happened here. You can just go through these fairly quickly if you'd like. Which is kind of nice to see. That looks like that hardwood swamp down as you go down towards the creek has not been touched. There's a digital elevation model, not very high. You can see it's 14, 15 feet at the highest, and it goes down to where the creek is. And then you put it in perspective. There's the parcel. This is the county's McCullough Creek Conservation Area. This is the Water Management District's Deep Creek Conservation Area. This is Mike Adams's conservation, actually, or has a state conservation area through a conservation easement. And so you see context for that piece of property as well. Next, please. And I just remember, Holly, a guy had asked us, although I guess he didn't formally ask, there was all those properties on Moultrie Creek. And I just went ahead and put in a couple maps that have, that's the parcel data, and that's west of the railroad tracks, which is I think between there and the next image is from the railroad tracks over to US 1, just to see what was in public ownership versus private ownership, which there wasn't anything in public ownership, but there was some undeveloped properties as well. And that's it. I didn't want to do anything else with that because I don't know if we were actually going to evaluate that at some point. I remember that gentleman had asked us to, but I guess he didn't formally request it of the county. It was before. He came in at one of our, I think it was our first meeting, I believe it was.
Yeah, I vaguely recall that.
Yeah. So that's a quickie look at, and then what I didn't talk about was the Anastasia Lakes has high and medium probability on the model. New Salem property, uplands are medium probability in archaeological model. The Clark McCullough Creek property, about 60% of the property is high and 40% is medium probability. I didn't mention the Clark McCullough Creek property is adjacent to the St. Johns River paddling trail, which is a state paddling trail on the river. And there's other information such as, what total maximum daily load basins, all that, which I'm not going to bore you guys with. So there is additional information on that, but that's kind of the quickie. I could write this up if you would like. I guess we're going to do our first run through today, but if you want more detail, I didn't want to go into it now. If I could write it up and submit it if you'd like, I can mail it out to everybody.
I think that would be helpful. It would be helpful to me anyway.
Okay.
Because, I mean, you've shown me 2 or 3 things as I was looking at these and was asking the question in my head, what other public lands are
Right.
those are adjacent to this? And, for example, the McCullough Creek property, I mean, you got, this would extend public ownership.
Oh,
along
you
the waterways.
already took it down, right?
I can pull it up real quick.
But I forgot to say, actually, one thing I didn't put on the McCullough Creek, and Jan does as well, is that the piece that's east of Mike's, go to the
30.
because it's actually not public land, keep going, sorry. It's the one with all the public lands.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, that piece right there, am I wrong that you guys are going to approach Jackson? Once it becomes, the project is done?
Yeah, the agreement, or what we had been talking early on with Jacksonville, was that that piece would also be donated to the county upon completion of the dredging project.
This was mitigation for the port deepening project.
Yes.
The deepening of the project.
So that, you're talking about, that makes that even potentially, in my
The
opinion.
last privately owned piece. On the New Salem piece, that you briefly mentioned, the trailhead.
Mhm.
So right now, there's no access to that trailhead, and so that piece would offer access off of 207.
That was Anastasia Lakes?
No.
No.
New
Salem.
New Salem,
The
I'm
second
sorry.
one.
Okay.
Could you go back, I'm sorry?
The one with the red dot at the top of it, there.
There is a road that you could get to
Yeah.
by the stormwater pond. They could, once you cross this slough that comes across.
That-
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see the dirt road on the
Actually, if you go back to the other one, you can see it real well. You
Yeah.
see this road that runs right at the property, and you have to go across the ditch that was built to do it, and to get up to the trailhead, which is up
The
there.
county acquired that piece a really long time ago, right?
Why would you have a trailhead nobody could get to?
Well, originally, we had nothing, because we didn't even know where they were gonna pave the trail at. That we didn't know the orientation of 207 and everything else. What ended up happening was they took a piece of old 207 and made a trailhead there, but you're losing about a quarter-mile of trail. And so, meanwhile, we got a grant, we acquired it, and you can get to it.
See that map?
It's paved up
The
there.
one that had the, yes. Gotcha.
So in this
down-
context, would it be, well, I guess there are some wetlands on it, but is it primarily a recreational benefit to provide that trail and the connection to the trailhead as opposed to natural resource benefits, or, I'm just curious.
I don't want to comment on the natural resource benefit, I just
Yeah.
want to point out
Right.
that it provides access to existing public land where we don't have access yet.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Jan, in all fairness now, a piece of property like this, which has got some size to it, you would probably want to use that potentially for mitigation credits in the basin, yes?
We would most likely attempt that, but as you
Right.
know, right now, we would be able to get it from the Water Management District, but the Corps and the DEP have not come to an agreement yet.
Preservation won't give you credits.
Right.
Question on the access we're discussing here. Is the access we're suggesting is going to come off of 207 and go through that property? And so like access, I don't know, is there ADA requirements? How much is that, how long is that run? What's that going to cost? Yes, theoretically you could access. I can tell you there's going to be a pretty significant cost to make that road go through there.
Oh yeah, it's more than a mile. It's a mile and change, mile and a half.
Yeah, and you're missing the right now, this trail goes all the way over to Palaca, okay? And so right now, this is, the trailhead. Did I do that?
Yeah,
Sorry.
you touched it.
I didn't know that. That's the trailhead right now on the old piece of 207. And the intent originally had been, of course, the intent long range is to come all the way into St. Augustine with it. But anyway, so this was acquired so that this is all paved trail. It's just never used. And there's not a rail line there. The rail line stops right here. So it's just, that was acquired to be that trailhead, and eventually, same family owned it, and eventually, try to get this piece here. There's trail grants available, there's all sorts of other funding available that could, help make that a trailhead. I don't know if Ryan wants to speak to any of that. This just me and my passion for my trail.
People do ride up there, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
You spoke to it, but since they put in that trailhead in 207, which happened afterwards, this was all happening, and then all of a sudden they put in the trailhead down in 207, and the accessibility of that trail is pretty good. So, would it be a benefit? Yes. Cost benefit analysis. That's when you already have the trailhead down the road. It's a little bit of a rough end, but if you start to get grants to be able to get that access, then it might be worthwhile.
And those are still public dollars, grants. It's still taxpayer money that we pay, even though it's going from the state or fed.
It's great to bring it back to this county, though, instead of to the Everglades or
It's
somewhere.
just a little concerned about federal debt and such. But so an example of this is we've got adjacency, I guess, so maybe get a point for being adjacent. When we scored in terms of connectivity, obviously it's connected to some level. It's just, I think, cost benefit. Hey, we've got a trailhead here. Hey, we've got some low-lying lands. It looks like there's going to be some wetlands to run a road through there. It's going to be clearing a lot of brimstone and palmetto. It's going to be very costly. Cost benefit. Maybe this scores a 2 or 1, But I think what's, again, kind of bringing this all back together, we've got a data source here where we say, okay, we've got existing public lands or trailheads or whatever, we pull up a parcel and we say, here's a data set we got. Here's a property that's adjacent to it, and here's a scoring that we can logically conclude on based on this data set. Ideally, I would like to see us identify all those data sets to match them up with our acquisition criteria, make sure we've got a data set for each acquisition criteria. Probably do.
Just as a general observation, like just my sort of thoughts on it. Being so close to 95, it's a desirable location for development in general. I mean, obviously roughly half of it's wet, so that can't be, the adjacent parcel runs very vertically in tandem with this property. So in theory, you go 10 or 20 years from now, it's developed with something. So that's just a general thought. And then.
So are you, to understand, you're saying it would be desirable because of development pressure, or it would be too much because of, it would cost too much likely because of its likelihood of development? I'm trying to.
Just general observation would be, I would think that the upland there in that vicinity to 95 will eventually have developed buildings, some sort of higher and better use than what's sitting there now. And so if we're, sorry, the title of the criteria. But
Imminent development proposed is a criteria.
yeah, so, that's to be considered in that realm.
Yeah.
And that's just where my, as I look at different properties like that, pops into my head of, hey, we need to think about that. And then, yes, acknowledge the distance of connectivity to the trailhead from 207. But if we're thinking not immediate access, or that longer term, some other organization or some other group is going to have to take and run with the fact that it's county owned. Okay, but in my mind, it's like there's a longer term, and a possibility of acquiring it now. So, all of that sort of churns. And Travis, to your point of like, we've got to start trying to eval, but in general of just comments, that's thoughts that come to mind specifically to this.
Right.
And I've got that on the others as well.
JB?
Because one of the things you've got a trailhead. It's pretty heavily used, actually. That trail gets serious use. And by the way, if nobody's ever ridden that trail, you wouldn't want to do it today when it's 105. But when the weather's nice, that is a great ride all the way out to East Palaca. It's actually pretty stunning. But
I just want to get in the county truck and go.
but you could do a small parking area, and that could be a trail. It goes up. And it's just another amenity. You could ride up here, you could walk. I mean, there's a lot of things you could do with a piece of property like that.
There's 3 categories under recreation where it would score well
Correct.
on those.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
from the aerial, it looked like there's a ditch or a creek or something in the south end of that. But that little jut out piece looks like it gets you more frontage on 207, that you wouldn't necessarily have to cross that water that appears to be
What
there.
can you go up?
And you could kind of figure your way through there in terms of if you.
That's actually a road right there. Ooh, oh, don't touch. That's actually a road. But yes, the cutout piece is much higher. So yes, you can have parking in the cutout piece, and there's all sorts of things you can do.
Just all food for thought, not a conclusive statement.
Right.
Yep.
All right, let's, we've got 3 parcels. We have a certain amount of information here. How do we want to, and what do we want to do with this in terms of trying to use these, or at least use the form as a part of evaluating the form and how we're going to do this process? I mean, But any thoughts?
I recommend we use the form, and then if we're gonna add different criteria, we talk about that at the end.
Well, I guess we're more to the point, what I'm asking is, do we want to sit here right now and go through this process? Do we want to go home and do this as homework? How do we want to do that part of it?
I was going to suggest we do it as homework. And what if we came back next month instead of waiting 2 months?
I'm certainly willing to do that.
We would have to advertise,
Yeah.
Right.
and that's a cost to the
And-
county.
I would be hopeful that JB could email out, or staff could email out to us the information that he's provided, because it was, again, it was quick, but the little bits he gave answered a lot of questions I had, because I was trying to do this just with the information we had, and I have a lot of question marks written down.
I like how
And I'll probably have more.
the elevations and the adjacent properties are very unique. I'm just saying that selfishly because my boss just told me I have to go back to the office and do something, so I'm sorry.
You have to go back to the office right now?
Right now.
Okay.
I
So-
would need to check on advertising dollars to see if we still have it in the budget.
Okay.
We are becoming at the end of our budget cycle. It starts up again in October. So prior to, I mean, these are
Well, let's-
$200 to advertise.
And
Yeah,
I know we've
let-
got-
let's talk first about when a date would be, just to make sure people are available, because July is, you know, a lot of people are on vacation. And, let's see.
We can
To that point, I know well, I guess I'll ask the question, but we're charged with having a list of 5 properties by October.
Correct.
And if we're every other month, we meet in August,
Right.
and then we meet in
Yeah,
October.
it's going to be tough to do it. I mean, if we don't meet monthly, at least between now and then.
What happens if we don't have 5? Money rolls over, right? Is that, am I wrong?
I would think if you had 3, if you only had 3 nominations, that's all you have.
Right, I would think under the resolution language, if you only had 3, you could present 3. I cannot comment on the money rolling over. That may or may not be a reality.
The money does accumulate over.
I thought I recalled that.
Yeah.
And let me ask a question. We have, just to be clear, we've got 3 properties in the queue right now, and that's it. Is that right?
Well, we haven't advertised. Nobody even knows about this.
Yeah,
It's-
that's kind of where I'm going, is there something that's going to create some evidence that other properties might
I have another
come
one
before
that'll,
us?
I have.
Or if we're feeling overly rushed to get a resolution in October, do we submit to or make requests to the board to extend that deadline for us, or what have you, to buy us the space and the time to meet according to our schedule, continue to pursue and develop, a recommendation, and do it expeditiously, but with reason, and submit following October? I don't know.
I'll
mean, it's just-
ask Keely maybe to answer that question. I don't know if that's something that would have to be done by ordinance or could be done by resolution, or what, and how many, what the process for, how many advertisements have to occur before
Sure.
that happens.
So as far as whether or not you would need an extension, I would need to look more in depth than that. It just says you have to make a recommendation to the board. Is it a time certain? I'm not reading that in the
Yeah,
resolution.
it says at least once each year to the county.
Okay, that's once each year, but it's not October. So I'm just, and I know that's hinging around monetary issues. So we would look at that and see if it actually is that October is a hard date, or if it could be moved.
I mean, I would think if we go through an evaluation and either 1, 2, or 3 of these properties score above 66, there's no reason we couldn't recommend that, even if it's a list of less than 5 to the county, and because again, if we push it out a year, none of these 3 properties might be available anymore.
Right.
Yep.
Assuming that we deem them worthy.
Another generic question that's in my mind too.
Sure.
Is, as we move forward with acquiring properties, is mindset of the board, like, we have it, so let's spend it. Let's go get what we can, or, you know, like, how do you balance we have 3 properties here, but what do we say? It's not great, we're over 66, like, here is one, but our recommendation is to wait with that money because it can be better utilized. Like, I just don't know how to walk that process either.
Can I ask a question? Jan, didn't, one of those properties, I thought Ryan had said something, there was interest in the county possibly buying it through real estate anyway. There was something they mentioned, if you guys remember that from 2 months ago? It was one of the parcels we were looking at, I think they'd already started to work on appraisals.
I am unaware of
Okay.
that, so if Ryan is.
Well, Debbie was here last time, and she said there was something that they
I have
had
a vague recollection.
Yeah, there was something they had an interest in. I don't remember which one it
I
was.
believe it's the New Salem property.
I think it was the Musalem
But
property as well.
I believe they are working on that for county acquisition for a county project.
Okay.
But I'm not sure it's that exact parcel. I do know the Musalem property is being considered for a county project.
That would come into consideration for us.
So just a general comment, since we're kind of bouncing all over the place right now. Like, may as well just jump in here. So just for context, Nassau County received 750 nominations in their first year of their program. So my concern at this point is not necessarily the list that we're gonna have to produce, it's the process. So I'm getting back to your point, Travis. My understanding was from the last meeting that we were supposed to attempt to rank the properties. And my experience in doing this, as someone who has a background in doing this, is that it took me quite a bit of time to do, even though I have access to this information, just like we do JV. And I've got a bunch of question marks on a bunch of the categories, because you can't answer those without having input. So, I mean, maybe if I could propose for the next meeting that we just really focus on this and the information that we can use for the data, at what point different staff members come into play, I mean, just nailing that down. Because I'm anticipating us getting, I mean, maybe not 750, but even if we get 100 coming at us in the first couple months, we need to have this nailed down.
So, hold on a second, Travis. So focus, I'm trying to understand, when you say focus, or you say focus on going through the scoring process on these 3 properties, or focus on the form itself?
On our ranking process.
Okay.
So when a property gets submitted, someone fills out that nomination form, goes to the county, what happens between then and when it comes to the board, and then what happens when it comes to the board to when we're ranking?
And is that concern more related to this potential avalanche of properties, or is it relate to the evaluation of these particular 3 properties?
Just in general, anticipating more properties.
Okay.
Yeah, I personally don't know if I really felt comfortable talking about these properties yet today, since we don't have this formalized and it is on the record, and I didn't really want to speak about their properties specifically until we had this figured out.
And if, by the way, if anybody wants that, it's in a PDF format that's on, that you can take off there. If anybody wants those PDFs, you
I
can
would.
send them out to everybody. It might help to look at them when you don't throw it up on a big screen.
Yeah,
And then
but
I'll send my notes out later, soon.
Yeah, and I'm happy to share like what the state uses for their Florida Forever acquisition process. You know, when they're receiving properties, that ranking system that they use and the data sets they use are available. We can use those same data sets.
I
to
used all the
start.
FNA.
Yeah.
I used all the Florida Forever stuff.
You know, I know we're trying to balance like getting all the stuff done really quickly and also not messing up the process. So that may be a nice middle ground there, just to look at that. And I'm happy to facilitate any of that.
Wait, could I say something?
Hold on one second. Okay, Travis.
I just want to say I love the idea. I think going back and kind of matching up data sets, you know, I'm not heavily entrenched in the environmental fields. You know, the value I provide is probably more real estate than anything. You guys know data sets, you guys know the quality of data sets. This is where I feel like I'm going to be just listening to y'all say, hey, this is the best data set. This is where we can match up this criteria with this data set. And we get to really weigh in on the environmental expertise or recreation, right? You know, all the recreation stuff, right? So that's where I think as a board, we're more dynamic. We're really benefiting each other. I can tell you guys, and again, Holly can tell you, real estate side, due diligence, kind of process stuff on the acquisition of land, we could teach a course on that type of thing. Getting back to the point about 3 properties versus 750, which sounds awesome, sounds like a very vibrant program. God, let's come on. What St. John's County?
Sounds like nightly meetings, not weekly.
Yeah,
pretty
yeah,
daunting.
if we were so successful to get over 100 applications, there's no way in heck I'm going to spend my time trying to go through and find data sets and all this stuff. It would become unwieldy. So, yes, we need to know exactly where the data sources are. We need a process that streamlines it. 3 properties being introduced at this point in time stinks to me. I mean, again, I'm not an insider. I don't even know how I got on this board because nobody knows me, right? Nobody really knows me. I'm on this board, but if I heard,
Yeah, somebody knew you.
if I heard that 3 properties were already being considered and we're already putting them before the board for public acquisition using public dollars, that stinks to me as an outsider. That means that somebody had already been in the process, know exactly what's going on, got in the front of the line, is already considering before there's any real competition. That stinks to me. And I'm not suggesting that's what occurred. I'm just saying the optics of the situation are very poor as a St. Johns County taxpayer. I want to see 10, 20, 30, 40 properties weighed before we make a decision that, yeah, let's submit this list. Because, again, if I gave a client, hey, here's 3 properties, you pick one, that client would never buy based on it. They want to survey all the properties available. So, again, that's my point. I think we need a lot more properties. I don't think we need to rush this till October to make a decision. The funds roll over, we can make that decision in January, February, and I think it looks a lot better. Thank you.
Good night.
JD, go right ahead.
One thing you could do very easily would be if our committee wanted to agree on a long series of GIS related type layers. The county has a GIS staff, full-time GIS staff, and they have some very good GIS staff. If we had an MXD is what the thing is called when you put everything together. Think of it as just like a program. So an MXD that whenever a piece of property came in and went into there and got evaluated, and they output something and they tell us it scored this on FNA, it had this, it had all this stuff. You could have that so it would be standardized. You're shaking your head no, they would not do that?
That is so labor intensive for county staff, and they are stretched right now as it is. What we could do is, in real time, bring up our own ArcGIS, and evaluate them on the fly here in the room.
While we're in the room?
Pull up a piece. We could then throw the archaeological layer on it. We could do the wetland layer. We could do LiDAR. We could do all of that here in this room as the first cut. You know, because to send several properties over to them, they just would not have the time to accomplish all of that. I want to put out just one more thing. You do have another meeting. It's June, so your next meeting will be August. We only advertised out to August because you wanted to have the meetings every 2 months. The ordinance says you have to have at least quarterly. So we're going to have to advertise to go beyond October anyway, for the October meeting if you're going to have one. You might want to decide today if you want to continue to meet every 2 months, if you want it more frequent, if you want it less frequent, what you would like to do today, because we're going to need to start thinking about that advertisement.
Well, it seems to me like, I guess, part of the answer to that question, short term, is simply whether we feel compelled to make some decisions before October.
And one last thing, sorry,
No, go ahead, Jim.
Remember, this board wasn't seated until January, and the ordinance says annual. So in my mind, you weren't seated till January, so, and Keely may pull me back on this one. You may have until January to complete this list process. Because it does appear that it's not giving you a deadline date, so to speak, but it does, and you weren't seated until January, so you actually would have a compressed time frame.
In the court parlance, we call that a rocket docket.
I would concur with that, Jan. The October date's not in the ordinance, it is an annual report, and so based on that, it's a reasonable, to come within that first year of having the work done. So I wouldn't disagree with that, Jan.
So I will ask the question again in terms of whether to meet in July. If we proceed on the premise that we have until the end of the year to present a report, do we want to stay on the schedule to meet in August and then in August decide what our meeting schedule will be going forward? Or do we want to schedule a meeting for July?
I have to meet certain time frames to get an advertisement out. I have to have it, I believe, no less than 2 weeks prior to the meetings, but then I also have to have it a couple weeks ahead of time into the record to get it, to make sure that they can get it on and get it advertised. So that would be my only limitation, is the timing.
Right. What's the pleasure of the board?
Bring it, bro.
Holly?
I'm gonna assume that we're gonna receive some grace on the timing of being able to report. And, for a collective amount of reasons that we maintain our scheduled meeting in August next, and with the mindset that we do need to anticipate sort of a plan for the following year on how many times we want to meet. I don't know if it's doable to say, hey, we're planning on meeting every other month with knowledge or awareness that we may want to call 1 or 2 more meetings and plan for advertising for, rather than 6, maybe 8, to say we've got a few more to throw in there in the mix. I don't know. But I would try and maintain a little more flexibility in terms of deciding on specifics to set it for the course of the year.
Well, if you wait till your August meeting, since it is early in August that you will be meeting, but everyone come to the table with a final answer of how frequent y'all want to meet, I could still meet the advertising schedule. But I would need to know that meeting.
Yeah, perhaps in the communication with the board members prior to that, assuming that we are going to wait until August, come with your calendars ready to establish the meeting schedule going forward for at least the next year, perhaps. So everybody knows ahead of time and are prepared, looked at their calendars and can bring them.
Since we're discussing adding a meeting now, because I think we are all kind of agreeing we probably need more time, we had talked about maybe putting, I forgot what the study was or the person that was going to talk about a certain subject. Maybe we push that off a meeting or 2.
What's that?
Resiliency.
Yeah, is that something that's a priority right now to have that person come in at next meeting, or would our time be better spent maybe kind of hashing out this stuff so we can make sure we meet the list by our deadline, and then having the resiliency person come in maybe early next year?
Yeah, actually, what our, the agenda said was to write a letter in support of a resiliency program. Looks like they already got a grant for it, so it's sort of moot, I think.
So we don't need that person?
It may be we could just get some written
I think
materials
that person would be
on
great.
the grant, what the grant involves and that type of thing without having an actual presentation. All right, so unless I hear a motion for some alteration to our meeting schedule, then I'm going to assume that we will proceed with our meeting as noticed at this point. I think one other thing that I'd like to be clear on, and I think staff probably needs to be clear on, is, again, for purposes of We talked about, Elizabeth getting the information on the data set that the state uses, getting information on these properties that you used. I guess my question is, what are we going to do with that when we get here in August? What would be the purpose or the primary objective for purposes of agending purposes and otherwise for that meeting?
Are we going to do homework and have these pre-scored?
I think there's value in doing that, whether we intend to move forward with that as part of a recommendation or not. Because again, in my judgment, Travis has raised some questions about the adequacy of the evaluation form. To me, trying to use it and test drive it is, and I've already found that in doing that, is helpful in seeing maybe what's missing or what's needed in the way of information and that sort of thing.
Are you, just point of clarification, are you suggesting we do that as just a sort of mock exercise, or are you suggesting that that's the actual scoring that then goes into the public record as?
I was suggesting it as a mock exercise.
So it carries no weight as far as the score goes?
Yeah, not that we would come with an intention to vote on it or anything like that, but just to go through it and maybe compare notes. And
I think that would be very valuable.
to me, it'd be helpful to kind of get an idea, where other members of the board's heads are on things as well.
We might find that we all have questions, like you said, there were a couple you were not sure of, but we all have those same type, or several of us have those same type of questions. That tells us something.
Now, does that sound
Yeah,
reasonable?
as long as our decision, our votes have no impact on the actual decision.
Well, I wouldn't envision that we would be voting unless we want to discuss adjustments to data set or the form. Would be what we would do if we vote on something. It would be that. as
For
opposed to-
amending the process. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But
No, that's
to clarify, amending,
right.
The evaluation sheet.
the criteria.
So with that, before we go any further, I'm going to ask if there's any public comment on this agenda item number 4, the discussion we've had to this point.
Oh, yes, Ed Slavin, edslavin.com. Thank you for a very good meeting. I'd like to suggest that the next meeting and all subsequent meetings be held in the County Commission auditorium and that they all be televised on GTV. Let's not hide our light under a bushel basket. This committee has proved in the last few months, in the words of the United States Supreme Court in the United States versus Dodderwich, it's becoming a working instrument of government instead of just a meaningless collection of English words, which is what we started when we had the BCC resolution. I'd like to thank Dr. Asner for his presentation. I'd like to thank Travis for his concerns. And I'd like to thank the Vice Chairman for opening this meeting to telephone participation. I had eye surgery today, and Chairman Dean was kind enough to help out with allowing me the videotaping. And for all future meetings, these meetings need to be done just like any other county meeting. There's just no principled reason for it. And I got a lot of hassle out of the AVA coordinator. No need to burden you with that. But as my mother once said, time wounds all heals. But you're doing a really good job. And I think we've got a lot of properties in the county that need to be evaluated. And one suggestion I'd like to make in terms of using the GIS and GPS data, it could just be that serendipitously the committee members looking at properties, you might find something you've never heard of before. For instance, back in 2008 timeframe, my then boss, Judith Serafin, and I were looking at the county's GPS map or GIS maps. And guess what we discovered in Lincolnville? A pipe that was polluting our saltwater marsh that had never been reported to DEP, but I saw a dark green line, and I said, Judith, I think that's pollution, and it was. But anyway, you're doing a wonderful job. You're really dedicated public servants, and I want to thank you for everything that you do. And if you ever have any questions for me, feel free to get in touch. I'd like to maybe send y'all some emails now that I have all your email addresses, and maybe at a future meeting make a presentation about the St. Augustine National Historical Park and National Seashore, which would unite 140,000 acres in 2 counties, all existing government-owned land, into one overall national park and seashore, like Cape Cod National Seashore, only bigger. And it would help get us the kind of the historic and environmental tours that the 2004 National Trust for Historic Preservation study shows they spend twice as much and twice as long, and they appreciate our history. And we're not telling enough of that history, and we need to do a better job of that. But I'll get you some documents, including testimony and articles and the actual legislation. When I first drafted the bill, of course it was first proposed in 1939, but when I first drafted the current draft of the National Park and Seashore Bill, Commissioner Bill Leary from the city of St. Augustine looked at my draft, and of course he worked for CEQ, and he knew from national parks. And he said, it's perfect. And I said, no, Bill, it's not law yet, but let's work to make the National Park and Seashore law. And I've talked to Henry about this, and perhaps it might be in order at a future meeting for y'all to ask the county commissioners to consider an endorsement. But thank you so much.
All right, any board member reports?
I just have one, and I'm not sure, I think I asked Sean how to best distribute this when you talk about board member reports. I had, last meeting, I had prepared a property acquisition evaluation form using the sort of template that we had. And I was prepared, like I said last meeting, to provide this. I had it printed. So I just want to give a copy to everybody. Of course, like it's a copy for public record. And again, just my thought on this, I think you guys got a lot better ideas than I probably do. You know, but this was the best I could do with my knowledge base. And what I tried to do is I tried to take the goals, like broad objectives of the general public, and what are, you know, every stakeholder in the public, what would their interest be in public lands? And then also, you know, there's, I think it's Commissioner Dean always talks about how do you balance private property rights with environmental needs, and you know, the conflict he had throughout his entire career on balancing those two things. And so I try to look at this as how do you know, what are the broad categories? What are the interests that each stakeholder may have, plant, animal species included, and then break that into goal categories, kind of broad categories, and then within that acquisition criteria. So that's my explanation of it. Again, you can kind of see what categories I had. I thought maybe we would all kind of come prepared at the last meeting to discuss something like this, but I just want to give everybody a copy. I printed out one for each, and of course there'll be one for the public record.
Any other board members have reports? Okay, any staff reports?
Just that the BBC has appointed Irene Kaufman to the District 4 seat, and that she has a background in computer software design.
Okay, we'll look forward to...
Yeah, and she should be here present next meeting. In August.
First name is
Irene.
Irene, I-R-E-N-E.
Yeah, I-R-E-N-E.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, any other questions or comments? Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
You do.
Okay, second? Nobody wants to adjourn?
No, Travis said second.
Travis, second, okay. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We're adjourned.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone.